What's up, everybody? It's your boy Drew with High Fight IQ, and you are now watching the MMA Conspiracy Hour with my boys Todd Adkins and Miguel Iterate. Miguel has been the matchmaker for over 200 shows worldwide and has worked with Hook and Shoot, Euphoria, Bodog, and ADCC. Make sure you subscribe to the Todd Atkins Show on YouTube. You can also find Miguel on his YouTube channel at MMA Collector 74. Don't forget to subscribe to High Fight IQ on all social media platforms, the House Call Sports on YouTube, the Fight Pit on YouTube. Now let's talk some fights, baby. Let's go.
All right, this is Todd Atkins, and I'm here with my partner Miguel Iterate, and we got a special guest today, James Werme. I did an interview with him a while back. He's from the SEG days, and he also crossed over into ZUFFA. He's one of the few that did, and it's a great interview. And today he's going to kind of give the promotional corporation side in this antitrust suit that we've talked about quite a bit. And I had talked with him on the phone for a while. It's really fascinating talking with him, and yeah, I think it'll be a very good educational stuff for people listening to this. And James, I just want to give you a chance to thank you for taking the time to do this, and introduce yourself for the people that may not have been around when you were.
Sure, and thanks so much for having me, Todd, and nice to see Miguel as well. My name is James Werme. I worked for SEG Semaphore Entertainment Group, which was the parent company of the UFC. I worked for them from 1995 to 2001. I also worked a year with ZUFFA, which is the group that purchased the show. That's Dana and Lorenzo Fertitta, Frank Fertitta, the ZUFFA team. I worked with them for a year. Starting about 1998, I started working heavily with the booking of the fighters. So I'm happy to provide whatever insight I can to maybe explain some of the logic and the motivation coming from the show management side of this question. I would like to point out that I am not a lawyer. Let's get that out of the way right off the top. But I have sat at that table on one side. So happy to provide any type of commentary or insight that we can kick up.
Yeah, and I know I had sent you some information on the lawsuit, and we kind of talked about some of this. Maybe, the first thing that I think comes to people's mind is maybe like, obviously there's a pay thing, but what we had talked about more was some of the contractual things that you had a lot to say about right off the top. So, we were talking about how they might lock fighters up for long periods of time or champions forever in some cases. Maybe talk about some of that you had some insight on as far as contractual stuff goes.
Yeah, I mean, some things that one side may see as draconian, the other side sees as necessary. And I can tell you from the show management standpoint of things, it is necessary to have things like rematch clauses. It is necessary to make sure that your champion does not leave with the belt. Those things are important to protect the brand. And remember, management's first and foremost priority is to protect the brand. And from a macro sense, it's the brand that provides the opportunity, right? So you can go back and forth on what's fair, what's not fair, but ultimately, it's the UFC's airwaves, and this is a costly endeavor to undertake from the promoters and the producers of the show. So yes, contracts need to be as favorable to the brand as possible because this is professional sports, and I would never fault anyone for going to the best deal and leaving when they think it's most opportunistic for them. But since that is the case, the brand has to protect itself. The UFC has to protect itself. So I would say that as a general statement.
Now, you said you guys did some of that in SEG as well.
Sure. I mean, I'm certainly have no idea what the contracts look like now, but I can tell you that the SEG contracts, which were probably made up the majority of the initial ZUFFA contracts as well. I know that that they certainly started with our paperwork as a template. I remember them bringing in a kind of a big time lawyer who had represented Lennox Lewis, a guy named Milton Schwabsky, and I think he helped them fine tune the paperwork from those early days. But yes, the SEG contracts made sure that the show was protected, made sure that guys couldn't jump if under certain circumstances. Like any contract is going to lock somebody up for the duration, the term of that contract. That's no different in a job or any employment type situation. I guess the difference here is it's a temporary employment situation. And, you know, at that time, it's not like there was a ton of other organizations that the guys could go to. So it's not like we necessarily feared that, although, you know, starting in the late 90s, Pride really made a move and basically took all of our top heavyweights. But that's the game of professional sports. The heavyweights were commanding the highest purse at the time. We were not able to match or better those offers. So the guys jumped to Japan. And there was no hard feelings. That's the way it was. But yes, our contracts locked them up pretty good. We certainly didn't have all the sponsorship and the external revenue type stuff that the UFC has now due to its success and exposure. But we protected ourselves for sure. We had to. It's tough
Miguel,
when you make us. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, Miguel, you can jump in anytime you want, just to if you have a question about anything.
Oh, no problem. You know, the situation here is if you have a contract like SEG has a contract, and you know, to be honest, a lot of the smaller shows, myself and Hook and Shoot, you know, perhaps King of the Cage, you know, I'll talk a little bit about Jamie Levine's show because at the time these were comparable shows to the UFC in terms of pay and size and stuff. And there was a little bit of interchange. And I'll be honest with you, we had a very restrictive contract.
Yeah,
but
you have
to pick and choose where you enforce it, and you actually have to back up your ability to deliver on your end of the contract as well. And so, you know, number of fights and things like that, or pay, you know, if somebody gets an offer for a good pay, even SEG, I think, would let them go to go do that fight. And, you know, hey, if you lose, we may not sign you again. That was the kind of back and forth that went through with SEG. It was very pure, and it was very much with an air towards competition, which was very much stifled under the Fertittas. That, you know, they allowed other people to, you know, be active in the sport. And that didn't happen afterwards. So I agree with you, everything you said. You know what I mean? And Bob and those people, Meyerowitz, you know, much respect. Meyerowitz was actually an excellent executive, you know, and a good man. And that's why maybe he didn't succeed, because he wasn't cutthroat. You know what I mean? He allowed some of that competition to thrive. You know, with Jamie Levine, there was a point where, you know, people might say, you know, I'm going to go fight for WEC, not UFC. You know, Pat Miletich fought there.
WF.
Several UFC champions fought on his shows while they held the belts. You know, I recently interviewed Dean Thomas, and Dean Thomas told me he turned down a UFC offer because he got an offer from TJ Thompson in Hawaii, and yeah, he wanted to go to Hawaii, you know? And so it was a little bit of a different atmosphere. And Bob, understanding business, was trying to work his own thing, but he wasn't operating at the cutthroat level that the Fertittas were. So there was the ability for some competition, you know, and you know, he worked around that. And especially the main competition I think he had was the Peretti show, because the Peretti show was on pay-per-view, and it was a good show. In many ways, a little more advanced than the UFC's in that they had weight classes and gloves ahead of the UFC. And they survived longer, because Bob, I respect Bob because Bob spent more time in court for this sport in those early days than a lot of people. You know what I mean?
Paid for
And
it too.
that and that's what people don't credit is his dedication to making this happen. And but it was never a mafioso level of cutthroat level that I feel like the Fertittas bought.
Yeah, so a couple things. So yeah, shows like WEF and the Hawaii show, I forget what the name it was.
Super Brawl.
Super Bowl.
Super Bowl. They were out there, but they weren't on pay-per-view. So they were in a sense competitive, but not to our big picture. And you talk about, yeah, fighters want to fight, and we were only doing, five, 6 shows a year. And you're talking about 6, 8 fights a card. So it was certainly harder for us at times to keep the guys busy, right? Keep the guys busy, keep the paydays coming. So those shows may have had good upfronts and good purses or comparable purses, but it certainly did not provide the type of exposure. You could wait and maybe the home video would come out. With regard to Extreme and John's show, yes, they were on pay-per-view, and yes, their athletes were excellent credential, excellent pedigree athletes. But they were much smaller than us from a venue and a distribution standpoint. And, we talk about Extreme as a competitor to the UFC in those days. Extreme's entire history includes 4 shows. We used to do 5 a year. So yes, it was groundbreaking. Yes, it was competitive, but it certainly did not carry the any kind of weight like the UFC did.
James, let me ask you to jump in there, because one of the things that happened with SEG and the original group is, yes, everything you're describing is correct. You guys, at the end of the day, we're still on top of the mountain, but you guys were shrinking, not growing, because you guys were getting off television and having to, fly events from Buffalo to Alabama to rescue them. And, I've heard stories about Elaine McCarthy having to go out and buy toothbrushes for everybody. You know what I mean? Because crazy stuff,
Yeah, Elaine was a huge part of that day, and I'm sure she did whatever it took to take care of people. And yes, you're right. We were shrinking from a financial standpoint, from an exposure standpoint. But during those late years, we also opened up New Jersey, and that's what happened. I said this a few times. The line between mainstream success and absolute failure for the UFC in those days, the late 90s, was paper thin. We were on the cover of Mad Magazine. We were on Friends. We were featured in not 1, but 2 episodes of Friends, which was getting, 25, 30 million households on a Thursday night for NBC. So yes, we were shrinking. And that's perhaps why Bob was a little bit looser with stuff, is because, it's tough to keep a noose around everyone when we're not sure when the next show is. And for a couple of years there, we weren't sure if we were going to have another show. So yes, those days were dicey, but yes, those days laid the groundwork for what would come in the early 2000s. And, also the exposure, the shrinking of the exposure was a direct result of cable systems, uneducated, unfair cable systems shutting us off. Everyone knows all about that. And happily and luckily the ZUFFA team was able to turn that around. So yes, it was a down time for the show for sure. And that perhaps caused us to be a little bit looser with stuff, but it was still on pay-per-view 5, 6 times a year. We were still the main brand. And everyone looked to us to further the sport, I think, on a more mainstream level. We were the guys, as you said, you mentioned Bob in court. We were the guys taking on those cases. Bob was the guy paying for those. We spared no expense because we believed in the show. We knew it was something special. We knew it could be huge. So at that time, it was a worthwhile investment for Bob. Eventually, everything becomes too heavy to bear. So
I got a question for you. This is an off to the side question, but Bob had an older guy, kind of a paunch. He'd wear Hawaiian shirt, shorts, and sandals, but he seemed to be the bookkeeper guy.
Oh, Stephen Loeb. Yeah,
God,
Stephen, you remember Steve,
character.
very much a character, very much a New York character. Stephen was a longtime SEG accountant, bookkeeper, controller, and he's the guy you got your check from after the
Yeah.
show. So that's how most of the UFC, at least the fighters and the managers, that's how they know and remember Stephen, was chasing him
I
down to
would
get their
describe
check.
him as a surly old goat.
Yeah, he had a lot, you know, he had to deal with a lot those days because he had to, you know, see the reality, convey the
Yeah, putting out
reality.
fires, and bookkeepers never like to pay when when things are in the red either. So no,
Yeah,
I,
it's
I
tough,
understand,
tough to
but
be
I,
the
I
mess.
remember him because Bob's original crew of people, they did share that passion. I like that they followed Bob. Bob was a good leader. I often wonder what would have happened if Bob had been sponsored by the Fertittas and not bought out by them. You know what I mean?
What
Because
about if we
Bob's
got New York?
leadership was not un. Bob's leadership was not without a rudder. He had a good idea where he was going. It would have been maybe smaller for a while and build up. But I like Bob as an executive.
Bob was great. Bob was a real entertainment entrepreneur, successful guy, real heavyweight New York entertainment. You know, Rolling Stones, Peter Gabriel, Sting, Bruce Springsteen. These are not small names, and Bob did stadium shows with these guys. Um, and Bob was an excellent leader, and we all followed him, and we thought we thought we were right, and we thought we were on the side of right. And what could have happened if we had opened up New York when we were supposed to open up New York? I mean, we bang out that show in Niagara Falls. 2 months later, we're on Long Island, home of the Rangers in Uniondale. Probably 2 months later, we were at Madison Square Garden. You've got a whole different deal. The
So
Fertittas.
talk about what took that apart. It was you guys kind of blamed Peretti, right?
Well, we blame extreme fighting. You can blame John or his partner, Donald Zuckerman, but they reacted in a rash, desperate way and took advantage of doors that SEG had opened and promptly got them slammed in our face. Everyone knows the story about the midnight run to Dothan, but you can blame extreme, number one. You can blame the politicians who did not support their athletic commission and essentially forced a reversal on a decision that had been made months before that. So you can blame the extreme leadership, Donald Zuckerman, John Peretti. You can also blame New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani and New York Governor Pataki. I forget his first name. No, it was
okay.
Pataki. I forget his first name. So
George.
yeah, that was a mess, and that would have changed everything. And that was 1996. I mean, if we're doing a show at Madison Square Garden in 1997, I don't think the Fertittas ever come into the equation. And then maybe Bob has to take on more of a cutthroat situation because, he opened up New York and now everyone wants to come through, just as we opened up Jersey and everyone wanted to come through. And those strives, those political strives, those sanctioning strives were made through the efforts of SEG and under the
Now,
leadership of SEG.
now you said something interesting there. Bob, I have no doubt, much respect. Him, his brother, they're New York lawyers, top of the line. And like you said, he told me a great story about Mick Jagger showing up drunk for a meeting and stuff like that. I mean, the elite of lawyers. But would he have been as cutthroat as these, the Fertitta guys at the end of the day are bookies, you know, with the bent nose kind of thing, At the end of the day, they're casino owners, and I think they came in to burn the ground and kill everybody. And I think Bob wasn't going to be that way, even if he had to take it to the next level. Enforce contracts. Okay, you can enforce contracts, but do you want to destroy newspaper owners, destroy t-shirt companies, destroy managers until they're all in your circle of truth?
Yeah, and I certainly don't know all the details of that stuff. I've been kind of out of it since. But and I can also tell you that in my 1 year that I spent with ZUFFA, I got no indication of underworld influence or any of that stuff. So I want to be clear about that. These were very successful businessmen. They had a casino chain. They owned a brewery. Fertitta Enterprises had a vast portfolio, and the UFC became a part of that portfolio. Who's to say what would have happened, how Bob would have handled things if some of the opportunities that we hoped we would have received, we had received, who knows? But Bob's brother was the lawyer. Bob was an entertainment guy. Bob was a promoter, producer. He had done a lot of big shows for radio. He had Bob basically invented syndicated radio with the King Biscuit Flower Hour, which was a weekly concert that they would sell to various stations around the country. Bob's been a pioneer of syndication in radio and television, and he's a pioneer of the pay-per-view business as well. So there weren't many people doing it when we got into it.
Let me tell you a little bit of background of Fertittas, okay? So, for example, I don't know if you know this. Who's the owner of the Houston Rockets?
I believe it's Tillman Fertitta.
Yeah.
There you go. So in their casinos, which I think are called Carousel or whatever their casinos
Station.
Station, you can't bet on the Houston Rockets, but you can bet on the UFC. Now, nice. There's a little bit of conflict of interest there. They are very powerful. Now, Tillman has bought up like all the Landry, Tom Landry, all those restaurants and whatever Tom Landry's legacy is. So these guys are a corporation on a very different level than Bob Meyerowitz. Now, if Bob had those resources, I'd like to think that Bob would have operated more within the legal standards. That's all I want to say.
Well, I can tell you we would have put the screws to extreme. That's for sure. And we probably would have put the screws to anyone that came near us, because.
But what do you mean by put the screws?
Well,
sign the fighters to more money and take them away? Or would you have run shows? Would you? I'll tell you a story that happened to me, because in 2007 I was with Bodog, which was, we had a billionaire owner, and we had a budget where we were flying. I did a fight show in Costa Rica with 36 fights in 3 days. This was
sounds like a real headache.
yeah, it was. That middle day is like, post fight, weigh-in day and fight day all at once. But the point is that was a $5 million budget show. So we had a big show going on, but the UFC, they're so much bigger and so much more powerful that they ran over us. They called up, we did a pay-per-view with Roger Gracie. That was our first pay-per-view, and we sold 15,000 pay-per-views because we didn't have the marketing machine they did. And we set up our second pay-per-view. Our second pay-per-view was supposed to be Fedor and Matt Lindland, and it was. But we couldn't get a hold of our pay-per-view executive that set up the first one for weeks. And it turns out that person was hired by the Fertittas.
Because of their expertise in the pay-per-view business.
Sure. Whatever the reason is, and I don't even know if that's true, right? This is things I've heard in boardrooms and things like that told to me by other Bodog executives. Yeah. But if that's the case, that's a little bit of crossing a line. And I think Bob was enough of a lawyer and also enough of an entrepreneur that, he accepted competition, not tried to cut their throats like that. So I think it would have been a different playing field if Bob had been there. And it would have been interesting, because if Bob had billions of dollars backing him, I love him as an executive.
Yeah. Again, who's to say what would have happened? And who's to say where capitalism and fierce capitalism steps over a line? I guess that's where the lawyers come in. But I think if you're in any business, if you have a pizzeria or a sandwich shop or whatever, the competition is the enemy. Um, and your feeling is every dollar that they get is a dollar that's you're not getting. So we can talk about Bob's compassion, but I don't know that we should go that far because we didn't like our competitors and we lobbied against them with what little leverage and influence we had. So
But you didn't hire executives away. Like I mean, the thing is this is there's also a line drawn by the law, and that's called the monopoly laws. You know, and I think the Fertittas have crossed that line, and I would have counted on Bob to be aware of that and not cross that line.
I think anyone that, especially in a new industry, and if you're the first one in or you're the biggest one in, you want to eat first, and because you feel like you deserve to. All the doors that were opened, sanctioning wise, pay-per-view wise, SEG, the UFC did that. You know, people that come in behind us didn't have to go through all those court cases and pay all those legal fees and go to all those cable system meetings and buy a table so you could hope to get 10 minutes with some guy that thinks he's so important that he knows more than you about this event and he's going to shut you off and suddenly he's taking millions of homes off your plate. So I'm not going to go too far with the compassion thing because especially in fierce times, especially in competitive times, you've got to look out for yourself. You've got to protect the brand. You've got to try to expand it in any way possible. So, I mean, you put the screws to your competition because that's capitalism, and the cream rises, and you know it gets gray, I'm sure, but the attitude doesn't change. The attitude is the same.
I want to get more back to details of the trial because we're kind of off the reservation here a little bit. You know,
and really, this is about fighters,
right? Yeah, and you know, some of the sticking points maybe I'll talk about is like we had talked about the sunset clauses, where you know Francis Ngannou is someone who took advantage of this recently, but there's a period of time where they wouldn't let him fight because he didn't sign a new contract. I think they might be doing that with McGregor. It just they haven't said it. But you know, he said, "I don't want to fight in December. Give me my fight." And they're saying, "No, you know, you're not going to fight in December because he has 2 fights left on his deal." And I think they're going to wait him out, or he's just never going to fight again for the UFC. And I don't know how long that would be. I would think he has one.
And so the motivation for not giving him those fights, because the money amount is, I'll assume, been agreed upon, at least the front end. So they're waiting what out?
Well, you know, like Ngannou, he had to wait like a year, I think, for his sunset clause to kick in. And then they had like 30 days where he could only negotiate with them. Then he had a period where UFC could match any offer he got it. I don't know how long that was, maybe 60 or something. So it's a long time to where he goes without working at all before he can.
All those things are written down in the deal when he signs it, right?
Right.
So, I mean, at a certain point, and I understand certain fighters have more leverage than others, but anyone that's dealt with contracts or lawyers or this kind of stuff knows that paragraphs come in and go out. So if you sign something that says those things, you know, I hate to break it to you, but you are contractually obligated to fulfill your end of the deal because you signed the deal. So I don't know. I certainly don't know the particulars. I know who Francis Ngannou is, of course, but I would say that anything that is written down in the contract, you can't fault the show for enforcing, right?
Right.
Yep, no, I agree with you. With Ngannou, we just talked about this in a podcast with Todd. They announced his fight against this Brazilian guy, Ferreira, that you know came through their tournament, but is a relative unknown. So that's what Ngannou had signed a contract. They actually, you know, from what we knew, they signed a contract where they allowed him to do a boxing match against Tyson Fury. I think they extended themselves by allowing him to do a second boxing match. And then he kind of reached for a third one. And I believe behind the scenes, that they kind of said to him, read your contract, brother. You know, it's like, it's time for you to do an MMA fight. And I think that's perfectly okay. You know what I mean? It's like, if you get the contract, you can decide when you're going to let people slide on the contract and when you're not, because that's what an executive does. You know, the truth is from the early days, even Hook and Shoot, our little company, you know, I was telling Todd, I probably own the rights to several of our fighters' firstborn. You know what I mean? Still,
I,
because that's what we put in there, but you let them slide. You manage
you
that stuff.
or you don't. You know,
Yeah,
it
but
depends on the
you
depends.
select. You
Yeah,
select when, and also that's the part where you have to be able to deliver too. You know what I mean? And
Mhm.
because we couldn't deliver, you know, a big time thing, if they went on to a big time thing, we'd let them go.
Right.
You know, and I think the UFC was under Bob was very good with that, in that they would let a guy go to Pride or go to do another fight or
We
anything
would
like
not
that.
let a guy go to Pride. We would not let a guy go to Pride. That didn't happen until Dana let Chuck go to Pride, which was after. We would never let a guy go to Pride and come back.
Okay, and that's okay to draw a line because you saw a competitor, like a real competitor.
A real competitor that potentially that ultimately got US pay-per-view. That was a big deal as well. You know, it's one thing when it's Jamie Levine in somewhere in Georgia, and as I said, maybe there's a home video that comes out. It's a different thing when there's a star that you've built suddenly on a US airwaves. You know, we believed in stars. We wanted to build stars, and if we built a star, we wanted to hang on to them. If the contract's up, you get outbid. You know, that happened with Coleman, Fry.
Now let me ask you. Let's take the example. You know, you said it was first Chuck, but uh, what about when you took the UFC to Japan? You used a lot of your stars there. Up, did you think you were building your brand there? Because
the purpose of the Japan shows was obviously to spread the UFC into Japan, which was a mature market for mixed martial arts. It was always a potential. We always talked about doing shows in Japan, but in order to do that, we needed a partner that would shoulder a lot of the financial burden. And that's why we did so many of those Japan shows in the late 90s, because we had partners that were not affiliated with Pride. We had partners that were looking to start up a UFC J. This was going to be like a franchise. And for us, those were cheap shows. We still had fresh fights on pay-per-view, but we didn't have to pay for everything. So that's really the logic behind those Japan shows, because they were economically sound and favorable at a time when we were strapped for cash, and because it was our entry into a mature market for mixed martial arts that we had hoped to bust into. I mean, Pride was doing these huge shows at the Dome. How can you not take a look at Japan? So that was the logic, but none of our guys, you know, there was no Pride influencer involvement in those UFC Japan shows. Maybe some of the Japanese fighters had fought on Pride cards, but that really wasn't our concern. Our concern at that time, fighter-wise, would have been the American guys, or the guys that came from the show that we brought over there to also showcase more to a Japanese audience. So that's the logic behind the Japan shows.
Now I want to get back to the contract because I'm trying to stay on topic here of the lawsuit. For example, we talk about sunset clauses, which is something that was put in because of the lawsuit. This was back when it first kind of came to pass, so to speak. And they have since taken that out. So what I'm saying is now they can keep a fighter locked up. If they don't re-sign, they can sit them for God knows how long, And
there's no term on it as far as 3 fights in 3 years or
I don't know
whatever.
the exact kind of deal with it, but yeah, they can really sit them out for large portions of their career if they're a champion. And it's not a thing where you can get outbid. You just can't bid on them at all.
Right.
I think what happens from their management end is that what they do is, if let's say the guy has a 4-fight contract, they kind of rush through the first 3 fights so that they've
See how they
got
are.
like a long time period to give them the last one, which is kind of a dirty move.
Well, but it's in the contract. You know, if some lawyer or some agent or some manager has to have the foresight to say, okay, this is a 3-fight deal, but it should be within a certain time frame. Otherwise, this 3-fight deal might take 10 years. That seems to me to be a glowing red light where there's a term, the term of the deal is the fights and not necessarily the timeline. And I can tell you that in our day, we probably we did not have a timeline. It was usually a 3-fight deal, and if you lost, you could be cut at any time. And if you had a championship, you could be extended anytime. If you lost in a big fight, there was a rematch clause. So those are things that have to be gamed out by both sides, and I'm sure it has a lot to do with getting in and just signing because I just want to get in. And a professional athlete has to have foresight because it is a short window. Most careers, especially in this business, you know, these guys are putting their health and safety on the line. So I don't know why in all the shows and all the fights and all the contracts, no one said, hey, can we cap this 3-fight deal at, 3 years or whatever?
Well, James, let me ask you, because you go back to 1995, right?
Yes.
So you had Bob Meyerowitz and his lawyer brother handing out a contract and stuff. How many guys do you think actually read that thing?
Well, it doesn't matter, I suppose, that they read it, but in theory, they have a lawyer or an agent
In
or
theory,
someone.
right? But how many guys do you think just signed it cold? Because it was a lot.
Probably a lot. But again, that's not my problem. That's not the
No,
UFC's
I
problem.
totally understand. It's not.
You got to remember, the managers now are all in-house guys. These guys work for the UFC. They don't work for the
And that's
fighter.
the other angle
That's
I
the
want to
other
talk to you about.
problem, I think.
What do you think? You remember Monty Cox? You remember dealing with
Yeah.
those guys and outside
course.
managers. This
Of
is
course.
one of the other aspects of what the Fertittas did that I think amounts to a monopoly. It's not just what they did to the fighters; it's what they did to the managers. It's what they did to the T-shirt companies. It's what they did. It's a mafioso grabbing a bite of every single income stream that they could find, including probably even serving as a house bet, as a house for bets and things like that. I don't know. That's speculation, but I know the mentality of these people work, and they grabbed money everywhere they could. Tap out. You remember Tap Out, right?
Sure. Yeah,
And
I know
Tap Out
Charles.
rose to the cream of the crop, right? They were one of the bigger companies. There was Sprawl. There was other companies out there, but that was competition. And now they shut all that down and it's just Venom. You know what I mean? It's a very different thing that the Fertittas have done. And then if you look at what they did to the managers, all the manager companies are, like Todd said, in-house. They're all friends of the UFC. If you look into it, they're very interesting stories about what the relationships are that, go back to, uh, you know, swinger clubs kind of thing.
Oh
You
man.
know what I mean? But
Yeah.
No, I don't know what you mean.
No,
here,
that's something Mariah Faber brought up, actually.
But I can tell you, okay, so management, right? There's always going to be certain managers that are funnels for talent. Uh, we had them as well. We were no different. Monty Cox was funneling talent. A guy named Robert DePersia had the guys, Phyllis Lee,
Charlie Angelo.
Charlie Ansel. There were always managers that you looked to because remember, for us, and I'm speaking for us back in the day, it was about getting quality guys, good pedigree, dependable camps, come in, make weight, put on a great show. And if there's a manager that's kind of doing the work for you and has the talent in his gym, I mean, look at the Militich gym. Think of the talent there. Should any of those guys been passed up because Monty was their manager? No. So I think I don't know the situation today, but managers that funnel talent, guys that hook up with managers to get into the show. That has always happened, and I think it always does happen. I mean, you see it
Yeah,
in all
but
professional sports.
were you open to, for example, saying, okay, here comes Miguel from Hook and Shoot with his management crew, and he's got a couple of guys that are talented, and we'll look at them, as opposed to saying, no, we won't look at them because they're not with a certain management company, because that is what's going on now.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, remember, we were smaller. We welcomed talent. We welcomed new talent. We welcomed those VHS tapes. We lived and died by those because that's how you scouted guys. Now the fighter pool is so much bigger, so much more competitive. You know, I don't know how these guys get in, because I guess you got to prove yourself on a smaller show or go on Dana's series or some version of that. But
Basically, you have
know,
about 4 guys. Tiki Gosen, who has a thing called Arsenal. Ali Abdulaziz, who has Domination.
Tiki's a manager now?
Yeah. He manages a lot of bigger name fighters. You have Jason House, who has Iridium, and then you have Daniel Rubenstein. I forgot what his entity's called, but that's basically the 4 guys for the most part.
I had a guy in South America who was 3-0, and I speak fluent Spanish, so he was asking me to manage him. And the minute I came on the radar, I got a call from Jason House. A phone call directly. I never gave him my phone number, but I got a phone call from him telling me that they had signed him to a contract, a 3-0 guy from South America, and that I needed to lay off. Very interesting, right? And again, you look at it, Jason House's relationship with the matchmakers and the UFC it starts at a swinger club.
That's what Riot Faber said, yeah.
Okay.
And
Okay.
there's many other people.
And Rubenstein actually lived with
corroborate
Sean
that.
Shelby. He was Sean Shelby's roommate, Daniel Rubenstein. So these guys are all they're all interconnected. At Tiki, he used to be managed by Dana. So they kind of
I remember Tiki from back in the day. He had a few fights. And
he's
was with
kind
the
of been
team.
in the media lately because Sean Strickland went after him because apparently he had some nefarious behavior in the past. I don't,
Oh,
that he's kind of.
No, I mean the bottom line is there's no opening for a new manager that built people up, and I think Bob would have been open to that. Like, holy Toledo, this guy's got talent over in wherever, but these guys are funneled to the existing.
Like if
company.
I had a guy that was 20-0, I couldn't get him in. I would have to give him up to one of these 4 guys.
I don't think Bob played at that level. I think Bob understood what a monopoly was, and would have kept away from that and would have put somebody on managing, the influx of fighters from everywhere. You know what I mean? And not just funneling it, making it simple. But that's what they did. Make it simple.
But what Bob would have done isn't really what this is about. That's what I keep coming back to.
Yeah, so there's nothing simple about any of this. And especially when you start to achieve huge worldwide success, you're never going to be able to handle the cold calls or the random VHS tapes or whatever. So you have to create a system, right? The bigger the UFC has gotten, the more successful the UFC has gotten, the more protocol and process they've had to put in place, I'll assume. They're doing so much programming, so much content. You've got to have a system.
Let me ask you a question. Don't you worry, and this is part of the fighters in the lawsuit, is if you're funneled to a certain number of companies that feed you to the UFC, how do you feel that your manager is actually doing a manager's job in, say, negotiating the best deal for you, if at the same end they may be employees of the UFC or in some way tied to the UFC, trying to do the best for the company and not for the fighters? Because that's not a manager's role.
Well, I believe the term for that is conflict of interest. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but
good. That's good.
But yeah, playing both sides, and to bring it back to the fighters, may not always work in the best interest of the fighters. Flip side of that is, I want to get in because I think I'm the best in the world. I want to be on this show. I want to prove myself. This is what I need to do. This is what I'm going to do. No one is held, the free will still exists. So yeah, I mean, you certainly don't want double dipping, and you certainly don't want to not have the fighters' best interests at heart. But in theory, those managers, their fees are coming from the fighters, so their interests should be towards the fighters. And I don't know.
And all I'm trying to do, and I don't want to seem argumentative with you because I'm grateful to speak to you, and your perspective is fantastic, especially from the early days as an insider. But there was a difference when the Fertitas took over in that kind of aspect of what, at the end of the day, the lawsuit says is a monopoly. And I don't think the monopoly can just be proved by just looking at the fighters and the fighter pay. I think you have to look at the whole picture and how they took over every part of the industry. Like I said, the t-shirt companies, when Tap Out beat Sprawl and beat some of the other companies and became big, they still used to go to the show and pick their fighters and say, here's some money, wear my shit. And you experienced that and stuff. And now there's a uniform, and they had their first deal with Reebok, where, say, the championship level guys made $40,000, right? And the first deal was $77 million over a couple of years for the whole roster. Garbage money. One basketball player makes more than that all for Reebok, But we don't know what the exact amount of the Reebok Venom deal that followed that afterwards. But what we do know is that championship level fighter made $40,000 now makes $42,000. So the distribution, they call themselves a sport, but the distribution is not equal to the NFL or the NBA or some of the other sports. In terms of, most estimates are these guys are keeping 85% of the income.
They're also, yeah, they're also fronting and assuming all the expense of all this programming.
Yeah, but not anymore, really, because it pays for itself now. Now that was okay to say when they were 40 million in the hole, but they've ridden that for a long, long time, and it's really not fair anymore. Because, like, for example, I'll tell you, they're masters of coming out with information, right? Like the Conor McGregor fight, that we had $20 million in ticket sales. We sold this amount for this pay-per-view. It's like, yeah, but how much money did you make off Vietnam television when Kung Lee was the headliner? They never tell you that. Nobody can ever tell you the total amount of money they've made for each event. And that's the problem, because, again, estimates are that they're giving out about 15%, and they want to be called a real sport. It's usually 50-50. The NBA, I think, is 53% to the players, and these guys make an exorbitant amount of money. But, at the end of the day, the richest person off of this sport, the biggest celebrity off of the sport, is Dana.
Well, they're not a sport, right? They are an organization, and they used to be a private
They're
company.
a sport when they want to be.
Well,
they call themselves a sport. Yeah,
they're the biggest players in a sport, and I'm happy that we can all sit around and call it a sport now, right? That's a victory. But they're a company, and they're an organization within that sport, and for a long time they were a private company. So how they handle their revenues is certainly not a public thing, and doesn't need to be. Now it's a publicly traded company, if I'm not mistaken.
I think they went back private, actually.
Oh, yeah?
They were for a period of time, but it wasn't long.
Well, I thought it was when they did the Endeavor did the WWE
split
deal,
up
the
recently.
TKO, the TKO thing?
Right,
No?
TKO, yeah.
So, but remember, everyone has the UFC to thank for making this sport a worldwide entity, and that's not cheap. And before you get the TV deal in Vietnam, you're probably sending over tapes for free to try to, and I remember this very well when we would try to open up.
I don't think so. I think all you needed was Kung Lee, who was already a movie star. They take advantage of things. And here's the other part of it is, like I said, at some point, it starts to sell itself. And when money's coming in, they're getting bigger and bigger. And again, What would be wrong if Dana White made $1 million a year for salary? Then he'd be worth probably about $50 million, not 500 million. But 500 million indicates to me he's taking a portion of the fighter's pay.
Well, I mean, I don't think that we should be arguing CEO pay, and I don't know that this is. It's
Right.
more about the distribution from top to bottom, I think, is the issue. But you know, as you said, Dana's the biggest star they've ever had. And that's valuable. His
Yeah,
following,
you're absolutely right. And not only that, but he's got more longevity than any fighter.
absolutely, absolutely. He's the biggest star the UFC has ever created, and it's incredible. Because I know him, and I remember him from the early days, and he was always like that. He just wasn't always like that on camera. So it's wild and it's unbelievable. And he's incredibly wealthy, and he is the ambassador of the sport. He is the UFC's biggest star ever. So I can't sit here and argue with what he's making. If that's what his bosses or his partners decide what he should make, I can't, sir. I can't. Again, we're back to capitalism, and
Right.
we can disagree on where the lines are drawn, but why shouldn't he make the most? Why shouldn't he make whatever he
Hold
can?
on.
Well, let me
He's the
ask
guy
you,
Hold
carrying
on,
Tom,
Miguel.
the load.
by comparison, in terms of distribution, David Stern doesn't make what LeBron James makes. Paul Tagliabue doesn't make what Tom Brady made.
Yep, fair enough. Fair enough. But they're not personalities that are driving buy rates and revenue streams. And
I
I
gotta
don't I
say,
don't
fair
think
enough.
I don't think Roger Goodell or Adam Sterling's uh, Twitter feed or Instagram feed are anywhere near Dana. Dana is obviously extremely influential. He's the biggest star they have, and he keeps the train rolling. So in a sport where fighters come and go, he is a constant. So say what you want about him, but he's the biggest star the UFC has ever created,
I want
and
to
they
ask you.
benefited from that.
I want to ask you about ascension to title. This is another part of the lawsuit. So, you know how in boxing you have these different sanctioning bodies, the alphabet soup or whatever they call it. So another thing they felt was problematic is the UFC is the promoter, but they're also controlling the rankings. Who can compete for the title, they're in control of that. If someone like John Fitch who wins 1 billion fights and they don't give him the title fight, doesn't matter how many times he wins. You had a guy like Bilal Muhammad this time who recently won the title, but he had to beat like 8 or 9 of the best guys. They were trying to get him knocked off. Can you see where that's problematic, or maybe if you want to defend it,
I can see where that's frustrating, but it's a show, and I come from the days before we kind of evolved into the sport where it was a show, and we would always look for guys that brought something different or special to the octagon, whether it was their look or their style of fighting or whatever it was, where they were from. So it's a show, and you're trying to create stars, and rankings. It's good to have rankings, but how serious is it? I know that it's fun for everyone to do that, but at the end of the day, the promoters, the producers are going to put up what they think is going to be A, the best fight, and B, draw the most attention, the most interest, for the most viewership. So, when we would book fights, we didn't necessarily back in the day have a ranking system. Obviously, if a guy was working his way up and he looked good, he'd get a title shot. But you're trying to create stars. It's very much a show. I know that right now it's all about sport, or that's what it has become. So the rankings fit right in logically. But you got to protect the brand, right? We're back to protecting the brand. And if I think the fight's going to be a dud, I'm not going to make it.
I want to ask you one other thing, because you may have had some experience with this or not. I don't know. You know how you have the Ali Act in boxing, but you really have nothing like this in MMA. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know that's something that they would like to see ultimately. I actually
I'm sorry,
talked
say
to
that again.
the Ali Act,
Okay.
that exists in
Okay.
boxing.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
actually had talked to Mark Wayne Mullen. He's a local senator here. He was on a flight with me back from Florida. He sat across the aisle from me, and he's been one of the guys who's kind of tried to push this, but he just said there's too much lobby against it with the UFC, the too much power and whatnot. But I just want your opinion on not having it in MMA, because this is another thing, that kind of falls in line with what we're
Yeah. And
talking about.
I'm not so familiar with it, but I can tell you that, boxing is a mess and they have been eating their young for decades. And if you want to call them a sport, but the UFC probably has hundreds of guys on its roster. The UFC has probably made hundreds of guys millionaires. That is not the case in boxing. And I would look to you to enlighten me on what exactly, where are the teeth in the Ali Act?
I think it gives fighters a little more freedom to say, well, I'm going to fight for this promoter or that promoter or this promoter. I can move around at will, and the ranking system, they're protected also, I
Okay,
win,
but
I move up. I
fighters
don't win
can
and I stay here because they don't want me to move up.
fighters can hop around in the UFC. I mean, I don't know how many quality organizations are out there to hop around
That's
too.
another problem with
Well, why is
the
that?
thing. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Why is that?
but the fighters, once their contract is up, they can do whatever they want. They're free agents, just like any
If
other
they can get
professional
out of
athlete.
their contract, that's the problem that we kind of come back
Well,
to.
they had no problem getting into it,
Right.
right? They're happy to get into it. So, they weren't kicking and screaming when they signed it or when they won their first fight or when they lost their first fight and didn't get dropped.
Now,
Right.
one thing I'll call you out on is there is an elite in the UFC of guys that have gotten and broken through to the money. But I think of the 700-man roster, you can probably count 660 guys that are struggling to get through. Even guys making 30 and 30, 40 and 40, you make $80,000, you get taxed, you get 55,000, you pay your strength and nutrition coach, your coaches, and this and the other thing. Now you got $40,000. You got to fight again that year, or you're making minimum wage for the year. You know what I mean? And
I know what you mean.
that's more the story. There've been enough guys that have retired on the poverty level, and enough guys that are not at the high rate, so that I don't think you can really say that they're leaving fighters on the elite level. They're in the NBA. They make enough money that if they screw up and they wind up, under a bridge, which every once in a while happens, Chris Washburn and guys like that, every once in a while it happens. But in the UFC, there are more guys that put in the work. I'll give you the example of Gray Maynard. Gray Maynard fought wars with Frankie Edgar for the belt. And Gray Maynard didn't break through to win the belt. But Gray Maynard was an elite athlete. But Gray Maynard, in his last title fight, was off doing real estate work because he was worried about the money. And, at the end of the day, that 30 and 30, most guys think they're going to win. So it's like, yeah, I'm going to make $60,000. And then when they lose, it's like, fuck, I made 30,000. And then, it all goes down. And it's not really a structure that favors the majority of the roster. And what the UFC banks on, for example, is, semantics. Yes, does the minimum guy now make 10 and 10 when in your era they made 2 and 2, right?
If that. We had deals that were smaller than that.
But 2 and 2, let's just
2 and 2 is a classic.
Field,
Classic,
right?
yeah, it's a classic.
So they can say 500% increase. And as a banker, I couldn't make a 500% raise over that period of time. So it's semantics. But
Right.
10 and 10 is still nowhere near enough for you to make a living.
Well, here's what I would say to that. If you look at any of the major sports league, I'm sure the guys playing playing minor league baseball and minor league hockey, and they're in the G League or the D League for the NBA. Those guys are selling real estate in the offseason also.
Yeah, but that's
You
not fair
can't-
because the UFC is not the G League.
No, but I'm talking about a population of fighters, right?
So let's talk about Major League Baseball, backups, NBA backups.
Well, those
The NBA minimum
organizations
salary is more than $1 million.
through collective bargaining, those
Right, which
organizations,
fighters don't have.
those through collective bargaining, they
Yeah.
have received league minimums, right? But those do not extend. If I'm playing on the farm, I don't get the league minimum.
Yeah.
So not everyone gets a
Right.
huge piece of the pie. Of course, this is professional sports. Performance is what is rewarded. Star power is what is rewarded.
I know. Look, in all fairness, I know a lot of people from our era that have blank spots in terms of the history. So I don't want to catch you, but do you remember Gray Maynard?
No, that name does not ring a bell. Not
He
from
was a
my days.
ZUFFA era fighter, so yeah.
I will tell you, Gray Maynard is one of those guys whose talent level doesn't deserve to be, holding his fucking dick with no money from his fight career.
Listen,
That's
I hear
all
that. Of course, I have sympathy for all those guys. But you can't. Not everyone is not everyone is a superstar, and I think nowadays you have more chance of making good dough. Back in the day, you didn't have any chance of making good dough unless you were top 5 fighter, and half of those had to be heavyweights. So, as far as progress, yes, of course, they made a lot of progress, and I think as far as overall opportunity, because we, I mean, I don't know how many guys we carried on our roster. It was probably closer to 30 or 40 than, now they have hundreds of fighters.
700, they say.
That's an incredible number. But given the amount of shows they do, you got to keep
Right.
things, coming and going. So I would say that I think that fighter pay, and I don't know all the details, but I think that there's a lot more people that are able to do this as a living than there ever were before. And no, you can't take care of everyone. But that's pro sports.
I
That's the
think you
contract.
you might make a great manager, James. Just listen to you. I don't know if the UFC would try to
James,
work with you or not.
Listen, and
but
don't think I'm not sympathetic to
really
the arguments you're
with
making.
the way you're thinking about this stuff, I'm like, shoot, this you got it all.
No, and kind
You
of
probably
off the
could do
fly,
this.
dude. I very much appreciate the back and forth, man.
Yeah,
and
Yeah, and it's
I don't mean to
important.
come across as a jerk because I give you a lot of respect.
And neither do I. In order for it to be an effective, productive, hopefully entertaining and interesting conversation, we have to argue both sides. And I've only sat on one side of the table. So I can only give you, as I said, the logic, the insight, the motivation of the promoter, of the producer. That's where I'm coming from. Protection of the brand, protecting the investment that you make in stars that become stars because they're fighting on your show. In those days, it was very much, the UFC is the lead. Because of our issues, we never had stars that really broke through beyond the MMA world at that time. Maybe Abbott here or
Frank did a
Ken-
little
Ken-
bit. Frank did some TV.
Frank did a little bit, but Frank was fighting in front of the
Ken did
smallest.
WWE.
Ken, when he went to WWE, certainly
Right.
became much bigger. Frank should have been, but unfortunately Frank was fighting and winning in those days that we were getting shut off and having issues. And
Yeah.
And Frank could be his own worst enemy.
well, and Frank proved how valuable he was after he left the UFC, signed a very lucrative deal to fight over there in Japan that absolutely dwarfed the money that we were paying. And so that's Frank.
Give us numbers. Give us numbers.
Oh, what did Frank make in Japan? I don't know. What was he making in the UFC? Not a lot. Frank's probably making 25. The most I ever saw someone make for UFC was Tito his last contract with us, which I think maybe the first fight was the Kondo fight, which was the last Japan show that I did. I think he made, it was either 60 and 60 or 80 and 80. I'm not sure, but that's where it was. That was the neighborhood. And that was big. That was big. You know, you think back, like Pedro Rizzo used to make like 20 and 20. You know, Coleman and Fry, those guys jumped ship early. So I don't really
The tournament winners made 50 grand at the end of the day too.
say again.
The tournament winners made 50 grand.
Well, the big check changed. You know, so it was 60. It was, you know, I don't know, was it ever 100? I don't know, but yeah, the tournament winners got the big check. But once we went to the card format, and once, you know, we had to pay these guys as much as we could to keep them around. There were competing shows in Brazil. There were competing shows in Japan. There were competing shows in the U.S. So
let's have some fun. How hard did you guys work on Ken Shamrock versus Tank Abbott?
I was not a part of that. I was not a part of that. That was a few fights after. I wish I was a part of that. That's what I wanted to see when they bought the show. I wanted to see all the old faves come back because I felt like I had seen so many guys that could have been huge stars, and especially guys that evoke nostalgia and emotion. Guys like Abbott and Ken certainly was a much bigger star. But at the time, they wanted to go very much sporting. Joe Silva was very involved and very influential, obviously. So it was more about the guys that he wanted to get in. And you know, when I would suggest, hey, let's get Abbott and let's get the Tank back, they would look at me like I had three heads. Of course, you know, a year or two later they brought him back. But yeah, I mean, I wish we could have played to the potential audience or the audience that they have now with some of the guys we had back then. Man, I mean, it was just so different in many ways, just from an actual event. You know, when back in the day, and I'm sure Miguel and Todd, you can remember these days, when the Octagon gates closed back in the 90s, you really weren't sure what was going to happen. And it was exciting and thrilling, and there was nervousness and excitement. And I feel like the show these days is a little bit lacking that. Part of that is because the athletes are so good and everyone is trained up, everyone's skilled, everyone has tape on everyone else. But it was just a more of a show. And I really loved that. I really loved that nervous energy and that sense of unpredictability that the show had in those days. So no, still anything can happen. Obviously, it's a UFC and it's MMA, and there's so many more ways to lose than, you know, it can happen to anyone. But yeah, I'm not sure where we're headed with this.
We saw something special. I agree with you completely. There's no doubt. It was,
yeah, and I'm glad that the fighters and I'm glad that the UFC has achieved what it has, because it's been able to keep these guys from having to have second, third jobs and make a living doing this. And nothing's perfect, especially when you have a huge animal like this, a worldwide animal. And Miguel, you know how hard it is putting together shows. Never mind just the shows. When you throw the fight game and you combine it with live television and a live arena experience, you're talking about a lot of balls up in the air. And you've got to have a tight reins on that. You've got to have processes for everything. So to fault the UFC for tightening things up, and obviously there's another side to that, but I'm going to take this side for this conversation because I've been there, and it's important to know that when you sign a guy, he's going to show up and make weight, and he is going to be ready to go in there and put on a show. So if I trust this manager to bring me guys like that, then I'm going to lean on that manager. We did.
Yeah, and the motivation, everything like that. Let me ask you, who do you remember as being the toughest guy to deal with?
The toughest guy, well, Ken was a giant pain in the ass most of the time, but he mellowed out as he got older. But you know, Ken was a bit of a diva, which was fine. He was the big dog, always gets the bark loudest. Kevin Randleman, You know, Kev was great. I think I was really fond of Kev. We spent a lot of time together. We did a lot of stuff together. And you know, I think he sometimes played the villain because he thought he was supposed to, but he really didn't want to. And I knew that because, you know, 5 minutes after he'd get my face about something, you know, he'd come over and, you know, chit chat or whatever. He would let me know.
I interviewed Kevin Randall on the phone one day, and his first words were to me, "Why shouldn't I kill you?"
Well, my first show that I was doing the interviews, Kev was the champ, or he was fighting for the champ. And we were getting off the plane at the same time, headed towards the shuttle bus. I'm like, Kev, dude, I'm doing the interviews. I'm gonna come, you know, backstage. We'll do stuff before. After it'd be great. We'll get you a lot of FaceTime. I'm not doing anything. I'll get a focus. I don't want to talk to, you know, it rips into me. And we sheepishly get onto the shuttle bus. Of course, he's sitting next to me. Well, we hit traffic going into Tokyo, and 20 minutes into the ride, he's falling asleep on my shoulder, you know? And so it's like, you know, Kev wanted to, I think he felt like he needed to be the bad guy at times. Who was difficult?
I remember UFC in New Orleans where Ken Shamrock had his wife in the hotel room on the 3rd floor and his girlfriend on the 5th floor.
Oh, I can't comment. I don't know anything about that. I don't know anything about that.
Do you remember when you heard that Kevin passed away?
I hear about Kev. I don't remember.
I'm not asking for the exact date, but
yeah, I don't remember.
You know,
I was very sad. I was very sad because we were friends, and we went through a lot together. You know, Kev was our champ in those late '90s years, and you know, I leaned on him for a lot of stuff, and most of the time he was receptive, and we had a real good relationship, and I liked Kev as a person, and I knew about his struggles earlier in his life, and it was, you know, I was very sad. I was very sad. You know, I wanted Kev to succeed so badly and get over some of the demons, you know, that were not his fault. And so really, I have a fondness in my heart for Kev. So I was very
what
sad.
I remember about Kevin is the love the Hammer House had for him. You know, Wes and Mark, obviously, it's like that camaraderie is something that we get to see, and it's so beautiful.
And that's, you know, I think Kevin was a very selfless individual, and he would always put others ahead of him. And that's why I think when he tried to be the selfish heavyweight champ, it just never worked for him. I never bought it for very long. So yeah, Kev was a really nice guy. And I was, as I said, I was real fond of him. And Mark the same. Me and Mark had a lot of good times. I had a lot of great times with all those guys. You know, I was real close with Pedro Hizzo, who I have a real fondness for, and Frank Shamrock. You know, me and Frank became really good friends. And Tito, we were all good friends. You know, we used to hang out all the time and get after it and have fun. Yeah, yeah.
Because I remember, you know, who made an appearance there, and he's a stud too, is Boss Rutan.
Boss was good. Boss was great. I spent a lot of time with Boss because, you know, we wanted Boss to be our heavyweight champion. So when we did that, we did like a road to the heavyweight champion. We had 4 guys that were doing an elimination thing, and Boss came into New York, and we spent a lot of time together. We shot a commercial together. We used to get after it in Tokyo. He was the mayor everywhere we went. Really nice guy, really fun-loving guy.
Oh yeah, there's a famous movie in Brazil about the slums called Cidade de Deus.
Okay.
If you've ever seen it, and Boss disappeared there for 3 days.
Oh boy.
On that trip, UFC Brazil. Pedro Rizzo came up to me. He was like, "Man, I'm worried. You know, I don't know where Boss is." and they had to rescue him. And all of a sudden, Pedro comes back to his apartment, and Boss is sitting there sending emails. 3 days.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, and there was a lot of camaraderie in those days because we were all fighting the same fight, and we were all working towards a common goal, and it was very, very family vibe, and we saw the same people. You mentioned Elaine McCarthy earlier. Elaine did a lot of the fighter
superhero.
and John, of course, John McCarthy, you you can't find a more important person. You talk about those court dates. Well, John was there sitting next to Bob, and we used to lead with John's badge and his experience. And Jeff Blatnick, cannot forget the efforts of guys like Jeff Blatnick, who really put his gold medal on the line and spoke on our behalf and went to bat for us when we needed people like that to go to bat for us. So really great crew. I'm trying to think of who I had beefs with or who I had issues with. The thing with Ken, Ken wanted to rip my head off. I had taken like Trey and Jerry and Guy to do like a local TV thing before one of the fights. And I forget which one of them was on the card, but Pedro was also on the card, and I had brought some B-roll of Pedro. But the B-roll I brought of Pedro was him knocking out Trey. And these guys were pissed. And like they're on the phone calling Ken and putting me on the phone with Ken. And I want to see you out front of the hotel. I'm going to be waiting for you. I'm going to be waiting for you. And, of course, by the time I got to the hotel, he wasn't there and he had forgotten it. But, and even Ken, we did an Ultimate Shamrock show in the later years. We did a tape show. We did a few tape shows, again, similar to the Japanese shows, lower production costs, still on pay-per-view, still getting it out there, still getting the show on the air. And Ken was a dream to work with. He was a real pro. We had a great time making Ultimate Shamrock, me, him, and Goldie, Mike Goldberg. So, a professional. Everyone acted for the most part in very professional manners because, we're all together in it, and we all felt that way. So that we didn't have a lot of people going against the grain.
One show I regret missing is the Puerto Rico show. Were you at that?
I was. That was my second show.
God, that's got to be insane.
February of 1996.
And I've seen cockfighting in Puerto Rico. So I know the crowd and everything insane.
Yeah, the strangest thing is right now I live about 2 miles away from the Ruben Rodriguez Coliseum, which was the home of UFC 8, the David versus Goliath tournament. Let's start with
you're in Puerto Rico now.
Let's start with the David versus Goliath tournament, which is a Campbell McLaren brainstorm that came to life and was, incredible. Look at that card. Fry, Goodridge. Two studs right off the bat. Bolander's in that one.
Where'd you get Thomas Ramirez from? Come on.
Local guy. I don't know where we got him from. We leaned on the locals to get the local guy. I think the local promoter maybe found him. And then the fight and Abbott going at it with Alan Goes in the crowd. And that actually created a rift or some trouble with the McCarthys and Bob. I'm sure everyone's heard that story, but
I thought Art Davey suspended.
There was a suspension. There was a first ever suspension.
And then Tank's letters, rebutting the suspension, were all written by Art.
Well, I don't think Art wrote it, but maybe somebody wrote it. But yeah, there was the first ever suspension followed by the first ever apology letter, and then everything was okay. So it was a brief, some brief beef, but we all got through it. Yeah, that was a good time. You had Bruce Beck on the call. Don the Dragon Wilson was still in the booth at that time.
I remember Jeff Blatnick mentioning chupacabras in the pre-fight.
Oh, did he? I don't know. We had some interest. I remember Chris Penn, the actor, was friend of the Dragon, and he came down for it. So yeah, those early days were random and awesome and fun.
And that was actually, I think that was Bruce Buffer was there.
Buff was there.
That may have been his first UFC, or that's where he solicited to be in the UFC.
Buff's first UFC. The first time I ever saw Bruce Buffer's name on a piece of paper in the SEG office, he was Scott Ferozzo's manager.
Yeah.
So whatever Ferozzo's first fight was, Bruce was his manager, and then Bruce got himself the gig as the announcer. But yeah, Bruce was originally a manager. Strange but true.
I'm honest on this podcast. I've smoked pot with Bruce Buffer in his own Mercedes.
Maybe tell Miguel the story about you laughing when you found out Dana White was going to be your boss.
Oh, well, I was taken by surprise because I knew Dana as the manager, obviously, of Chuck and Tito, two top guys. So I guess I didn't put it together that he would give up that position or relinquish that position, or I guess I didn't realize how close he was with those guys. So yeah, we would drive. I was driving down to Atlantic City on my way to the Taj for whatever prep hotel meeting arena stuff. And Dana called me. I remember it was pouring rain, and Dana called. He said, "Hey, it's a done deal. We just bought it, and I'm going to be the president of the UFC." And I was like, "Whoa, really?" I was like, surprised and kind of surprised because I knew of his background and I just hadn't envisioned him taking over my job. And that was the other thing is he was essentially taking over my job. So some of that laughter may have been nervous laughter.
He was a much different person than his demeanor, at least. When he first appeared on the UFC broadcast, his demeanor was totally different than he is today.
Yeah, because those guys were fans. They were they were big time fans of the show, and there was a sense of kind of excited, happy to be here, friends. We want to make friends with everyone. I mean, a lot has changed, and remember, going through whatever they went through, 4 or 5 more years of pain and expense to turn the show around. They thought it was going to happen much quicker than that. So, by the time they're breaking through and they get the Ultimate Fighter on the air, and suddenly these guys don't want to fight each other, I can, I'm not surprised to see Dana walk in there and say, you want to be a fucking fighter or what? Here we go. We're here. What are you doing? So there was always that in his personality, behind closed doors and in meetings. I always tell people like, Dana these days, he gets a pass for his, abrasiveness because of the success. But back then, they didn't have the success, but he was still kind of abrasive. But yeah, they were different. They were new to it. They weren't TV producers. They weren't fight promoters. They were fans. They were big fans. They were excited to meet these guys and hang out with these guys and put on shows and learn how to do it and see how it gets done. And anytime you walk into a new situation like that, a new industry, a new business, you got to learn it before you can be cocky about it. So yeah, those guys, I can't say enough about how well they treated me that first year. They put me at ease from the beginning and told me that they wanted me to be a part of the team. And they wanted me to move out to Las Vegas, and they wanted me to keep doing what I was doing. Not all of it, but these things.
Did you move to Las Vegas?
Yeah.
Because I remember there was a whole series of back and forth where Joe Silva had moved to Las Vegas and then moved back to Virginia. I think he's from Virginia or from that area, and there was some controversy there because Joe, I think, resisted a little bit of the way they did things.
That happened later, it sounds like, because when I moved to Vegas, so they buy the show in January. I moved to Vegas after, I think, UFC 32, which was at the Meadowlands, which was probably spring of 2001. So I'm in Vegas like late spring, and Joe was there. Okay. And as I said, they treated me excellently. I stayed in one of their properties for months. I had a meal card. They gave me a rental car. They gave me everything that I would have needed to make a comfortable transition to the office. We went to a Pride show. I've done a couple of these interviews. No one ever asked me about the Pride show we went to. It was
the Vegas show. I was there.
No, this is in Tokyo.
Okay.
This is in Tokyo.
Which one did you go to?
It was the one where Tito gave Sakuraba flowers before the main event. I think Vanderlei soccer kicked Sakuraba to end that one.
First fight.
I forget which.
I think it was the first fight.
It would have been probably summer of 2001.
Mm-hmm.
But we all hopped on the private jet. We go over to Tokyo, first class everything. They bought me a new suit. They bought me an Armani suit for on air. Hey, we don't want you to wear the polo. We want you to wear your suit. Let's go get a suit. They were very good to me. I can't say that enough. They treated me like any new employee would want to be treated. And from, like I said, from the start, Dana said, "Hey, we want you to be a part of the team." And I was the only one. I was the only employee that went. You know, Joe was a consultant; he was hired, but I was the only person from New York that went with the show to Las Vegas.
Now,
Who would
Pride,
you consider?
hold on a second. I lived in
Go ahead.
Japan 2002 to 2005. I went to a ton of Pride shows. Maybe tell me your experience when you went. What did you think?
I was blown away. But remember, those Pride shows were the dream that I had for the UFC. I always wanted the UFC to have the show and spectacle of the WWE and the intensity of a heavyweight boxing fight. I thought you could combine the two. And at that time, Pride was the best at doing that. And I think we were in the dome, we were in the front row, lasers, fireworks, music, lights, great fights, big names. You know, that was an incredible experience, a great experience. You know, I knew the executives of Pride. I knew Hideki and Yukino pretty well, but I had never gone. We had never gone to a Pride. I had never gone to a Pride, and we went there as guests of the Pride organization. I met Antonio Inoki, which was thrilling.
Slap
You know,
you?
sorry, he didn't slap me,
Slap
no,
you?
but his hands was like shaking a catcher's mitt. You know, that was thrilling, and that was incredible. And like I said, we did a lot of those things that first year of ZUFFA because those guys came in raring to go and spending money and advertising and production and lasers and pyro, and we went for it and we had a blast. You know, we did that big photo shoot with Carmen Electra and all the other supermodels that was in all of the men's magazines at the time. And they upped the production. We upped production, you know, add a zero, add two zeros. You know, there's pyro, there's lasers, there's music, there's screens, great stuff. They also put a lot into the fighter development. And this is where we talk about some of the costs that you don't see. You know, the untrained eye watches the show and doesn't know that, hey, when you do these up close features and training camp interviews and stuff, you know, those are costly. And one of the first things they did, they sent me to Rio to hang with Pedro before a fight. They sent me to Huntington Beach to see Tito. They sent me to Oklahoma to hang with Evan Tanner. They sent me to Australia for a week to hang with Elvis Sinisek. And we did that because they were committed to fighter development. And fighter development is cost, right? And that's what you say, where these guys are investments, and most of them don't pan out. That's important to mention is most of the investment you put into fighters does not pan out. You know,
Yeah, Elvis.
Ronda Rousey's and Conor McGregor's do not grow on trees. So it costs just as much to hype someone that doesn't become a star as someone that does. So it's important to remember there's a lot of costs that people are not aware of that goes into running a promotion, running a television production, especially one that cranks out stuff like the UFC.
I want to ask you something you commented on. I saw Frank talk about this recently, and I've seen people kind of debate it, commenters and everything. He was talking about, you were talking about the advertisement with Carlos Newton and his white, tidy white,
Yeah,
whatever, and
yeah.
Tito all oiled up and Carmen Electra. So for what Frank had said, this was on a recent podcast. It was a Rampage Jackson. I think it's called the Jackson podcast, maybe. But he had said that he was living in station casinos and he would train Dana and Lorenzo in the mornings. And at night, he said for 2 weeks, they would go down at night and have dinner, whatever, and talk about business, right? So they come to him with their plan, near the end of the second week, and they said, "This is our plan," and they lay out the thing that you just talked about. Carlos Newton, Tito Ortiz, Carmen Electra. And what Frank had said was he didn't feel like the sport was ready yet, that it was still pretty damaged at that time. That a lot of people don't even know, about the sport, or that it's something you can get on pay-per-view. And what he was saying was they told him, "Hey, you're wrong," and that was pretty much it. Their relationship pretty much ended at that point. So, what people are saying, well, Frank was stupid to say that. And some people are saying, well, they spent $40 million, so maybe he had some good. In a way, they're
Okay,
both right and both wrong. But I
yeah,
wanted
and
you to talk about that a little bit, his
I
comment.
was also living in the station casino during that time, and so I was hanging out with Frank a lot too. And they did not sever the relationship with Frank over a conversation at dinner. That's not what happened. They had different ideas of Frank's. They had different ideas for Frank's future with the organization. Is why they parted ways.
That's not easy to deal with.
Yeah, he was saying they wanted him to fight for them, but
Of
the
course they did.
idea that he had that the sport was
Of
still
course we did.
damaged. What do you think coming
Well,
from that angle?
I don't agree with that because their whole goal, the Fertitas, their whole goal was to make a splash and to rebrand the event and to put a fresh coat of paint on the event and to maybe showcase the event in places it had never been showcased before. Rolling Stone magazine, Maxim, FHM, all those big magazines, first of all, you're hitting your target market. Second of all, there's a pretty good chance that in whomever sees those ads, first of all, they were great looking ads with beautiful women and our top fighters. So what's wrong with that? And most of the people that were going to put eyeballs on that had either seen older shows, had heard about it, had gotten together at a buddy's. I didn't know it was still on. What is this? The whole goal was to rebrand it. The whole goal was to relaunch it. So they were thinking very big at that time. And that's how they do things. That's how those guys did things. One of the first things we did after I moved out to Vegas is we did like a retreat weekend at the Fertitta home in Laguna Beach, which is incredible. But we spent a weekend going through a binder that was this thick, talking about every facet of the business and how they wanted to move forward. These guys had a plan. It was dialed in. Thankfully, when it didn't turn around, and Dana's the biggest star, but maybe the biggest unsung heroes, and I don't know if you want to hear this, the biggest unsung heroes of mixed martial arts are Lorenzo and Frank, because they stuck it out. I mean, they stuck it out. And yes, similar to Bob in our time.
They didn't make $1 billion,
Dude, they lost tens of millions of dollars
Right.
before, and I think they thought that they were gonna come. I know that they thought they were gonna come in and turn it right around. As soon as they got Vegas, everything would be fine. And it wasn't. So they endured many similar hardships that SEG did. Different times, different players, different circumstances, but they knew they had something special. They had the fortitude to stick with it until it came to fruition. And so
they had the passion.
They had the patience, they had the passion. And again, just like us in the 90s, they knew they were right. Just needed to catch a break, right? Just needed to catch a break.
Compared to the PFL guys, and the bottom line is the PFL guys are not coming out of pocket, and they did.
They did for years, and they did to the tune of millions and millions of dollars. So without their commitment and fortitude to the sport, we aren't where we are. So you want to talk about this, talk about that, but let's sing their praises as well, because they picked up a fledgling organization that needed stewardship and financing. They were willing to do it. Right off the bat, fighter pay went up. Again, when they purchased the show, they wanted the fighters to be making more money. They wanted the fighters to be on the pages of Rolling Stone and Maxim. They wanted the fighters to be on the 11 o'clock news, the sports. They wanted them to be on Sports Center. And here we are. It was their foresight and their commitment and their financing, which ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what's the most important thing. If Bob doesn't go through, if Bob doesn't pay those lobbyists and push through things, and we get Jersey, if the Fertittas don't push through Nevada and stick it out for years until it turns around, who knows what happens? So you gotta sing those praises, because it's very important, very important.
Let me ask you a question. So when the Fertittas bought the UFC, really, who was the top executive that came over from the old days in SEG? Was it Joe Silva? Because Peretti was gone. Who was it?
You're talking to him, dude.
You feel comfortable saying that? Tell us.
Yeah, I feel comfortable saying that. I was the lead executive on the UFC when the Fertittas bought it, and Dana. Joe Silva was an outside consultant.
Yeah.
Joe Silva was not the matchmaker. John
I
Peretti
remember
was.
that. Joseph used to make $500.
Joe was an outside consultant. He was a very valued outside consultant, and he had been a very valued outside consultant for years. But Joe was never on staff. He certainly was never on salary. He made a monthly stipend. John Peretti was not an employee of the UFC. John Peretti was the matchmaker. We used John's abilities and knowledge to make fights, and John got a per show fee. The people running the UFC at the time Bob sold it was Bob, obviously, me, Stephen Loeb, the accountant, and a woman named Paula Romero, who was the coordinator, who did like
I remember
the
Paula.
travel and stuff. So that was it. That was
Paula
it.
really loved Vitor Belfort.
I was the lead executive from the time David Isaacs left in 1998, right? So when in 1995, when I start, SEG is very top heavy. You got Bob at the top, you got David Isaacs, Cable McLaren, Michael Pilot, Michael Abramson. Pilot and Abramson are gone by 96, 97. Art Davies out by 97. Campbell's out by 97. David Isaacs is the lead executive. And then David leaves in 1998, and it's all of those responsibilities that had been shifted between Michael Pilot, the in-house production, Cam McLaren, the creative executive, Michael Abramson, the affiliate relations, David Isaacs, the chief operating officer. All of those responsibilities fell on me. Bob, at the same time, had started up IATA.com. So at the same time, everyone has left and all the responsibility is falling on me. Bob's attention is towards his new startup. The .com startups were the fever at that time. So I was booking the buildings. I was making all the TV. I would spend my day in the office in New York, and then I would spend all night in the edit room down the street on East 57th Street. So there was no one closer making more decisions about the UFC than me.
Yeah. And if you
I challenge anyone to tell me who it was, because when ZUFFA buys the show, they hired one guy.
No, that's cool, and I totally appreciate that, and no rebuttal or anything like that. But I had mentioned that Joe Silva was the highest executive that crossed over.
No,
Joe wasn't even an employee.
Yeah, James tells the story on our previous interview. Campbell handed him was it a yellow sticky?
He handed me a
yellow sticky. This is our super fan.
This is our super fan. Talk to him every week or two, find out what he has to say. He's a big time fan of the show. He's a big time fan of mixed martial arts. He knows what he's talking about. He's plugged into those scenes. And as I said, Joe was a very valued consultant, but Joe was a consultant. Joe did not appear ever in the office. We used to fly him in for shows as part of his compensation, but Joe was not making any decisions with regard to the show.
That wasn't always the case.
I decided where the show was. I decided when the show was. I decided what video pieces we would do. I wrote and produced every tape piece that you saw. Joe worked with our talent, of course. And as I said, I was the only one that went to the show from New York. Joe, of course, was hired to be the matchmaker, but that was the first time he had ever made matches, right? Yeah. We had gotten Joe's suggestions about matchmaking for years. And sometimes we listened, sometimes we didn't. But John Peretti was the matchmaker. But the only executive.
I wanted to ask you about that. When Art left, was there a feeling that Joe wasn't ready? So you got John Peretti? Because John Peretti was a competitor.
Art was fired, and Extreme was out of business. And John had done the Contenders, but that was a one-off. John had done an excellent job for Extreme, and John was someone that we knew could do it, and we needed someone to do it. I don't know that Bob ever saw Joe as someone that I don't know that Bob ever saw Joe as his matchmaker. Joe was his consultant. Joe was a sounding board. Joe was, as I said, a valued opinions, but we wanted a guy that could get it done. Remember, those were tough times. We needed someone that we knew could get it done, that could bring us quality guys. good backgrounds, good pedigree, good camps, come in, make weight, fight their ass off. That's what we wanted. And John was able to do that. We knew he was able to do that because he did it for Extreme. And, Extreme had some great guys from, as you know, Brazil. Extreme had Olympians, that was meaningful to us. And we liked that John could attract that kind of talent, and he was plugged into those worlds. So John was an obvious candidate.
He was premier. Now, let me ask you, because there's a rumor, not a rumor, but I think you've told Todd that Bob was never going to sell the UFC to a John Perretti entity. And John's got a personality that's tough to deal with. But at the end of the day, he is really the best.
It's interesting. When I told John that, he said he had no idea that you guys had that conversation. Like he was totally shocked. He was like, "Man, this is the first I'm hearing of it." Yeah.
He was shocked. I'm sure he was shocked. He was shocked by the whole situation. Bob had multiple buyers, and John didn't know that, I'm sure, at the time. I'll retell the story quickly. I was in very close communication with John during that whole process. We talked a lot. He thought it was a done deal. And Bob decided to sell to ZUFFA instead, which was his prerogative. You can entertain multiple offers and then make a choice. Bob was the owner of the show. He could do that. It was
John got sued by John's backers.
Well, again, I didn't know about. Yeah, they put down a deposit, which was stupid. They were dumb, and I didn't know about that. I didn't know about that at the time, but I don't know why the hell you would give someone a loan with no type of recourse or commitment. But yes, I remember it very vividly. I hung up the phone with John. Bob happened to be walking by my office. I said, "Bob, what the hell's going on? Peretti is talking like he's going to own this show." And Bob looked at me and said, "James, I will never sell this show to John Peretti." So he was entertaining. You're gonna keep everyone on the hook as long as possible, and that's what he was doing.
It's funny.
And I don't know all the details of the final deal, but he must have got a better deal.
I can tell you that John's backer, who's got good money because he backed many of my shows in Florida, when he looked into the Fertittas, he said, "It's in the right hands."
Yeah, and Bob, that's what Bob told me. When he finally broke the news to me, he said, "These guys are princes of Las Vegas. They're going to do good things with the show." And Bob was tapped out. He had, he was beat. He put in too much of his own dough, too much of his time, blood, sweat, and tears. It wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't going the right direction. And like I said, at the same time, he had his .com startup, which had received major funding from a big bank in New York. So he was very excited about that new endeavor as well. And he was really at peace with passing it along, especially to people that he thought was going to further the show. I don't know that Bob had that confidence in the other group. I don't know if it came down to money or if it came down to feel as to why Bob chose the Fertittas, but on paper, okay, we got a casino family, former member of the Nevada State Athletic Commission versus the guy that used to run my competitor and his money friend. I don't know that that's a fair competition.
Now, let me ask you a question. Does Bob think he got enough money?
Does Bob what?
He got enough money for this.
Oh, I mean, he said yes to the deal, so at the time he would agree. Listen, we all knew that this could be huge. So anytime you get out early, you wonder what could have been. But
so Bob is probably in his apartment in New York, a beautiful penthouse, smashing his head against the wall.
No, because I mean, I don't know. I haven't talked to Bob in a long time, but I would have to say probably not, because maybe we would not have been able to make the headway that these guys have been able to make. And, I can tell you about my own personal experience of, hearing the news about this new TV deal or the sale to Endeavor, when we're talking about billions. I'm like, wow, I used to be front row for that. That's exciting. And holy shit, I wish I was a part of that. But you know what? They've probably gone through 4 or 5 of me since my time. So it's, you know, you appreciate the time you had. You look back fondly on the memories 20 years later. You be proud. I'm proud of the work I did on the show. I'm proud of what they do these days. I'm proud of what the ZUFFA team was able to do, because that's what their goal was. That's what their promise was, and that's what we all hope for, right? They were a godsend. Um, they had the financial wherewithal. They had the great attitude.
Yeah, the passion.
Yeah, yeah. There's no substitute for that. So I mean, yeah.
I'll
Does
tell
Bob
you,
wish does
the
Bob
only
wish he
time,
sold for $4 billion? Yeah, he does. But yeah,
the only time I met Dana White, I was doing a show at the Songus Arena
in
in
Springfield.
Massachusetts, up in your area.
Yeah.
And he showed up, you know. I shook his hand, and there were a bunch of things. And at the end of the day, he stole both of my main event fighters. It was Jorge Rivera against Travis Lutter.
He was scouting.
Yeah, he was on top of his game the whole way, and there I was just shaking hands.
Well, that happens. That happens.
Yeah, no,
Talent.
he's a cutthroat guy, but he's a guy that his level of commitment, his level of competitiveness. I compare him to Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant. That competitiveness is so elite that you can't compete with that. I there was no way I could.
Yeah.
I had companies with backup, with money and stuff like that, but we weren't playing the game at his level, man. So I respect.
And
I got my ass.
you have to be, because the UFC is a grind, and I can't believe that he's still doing it, and the way he's still doing it, and the amount that the show relies on him as the main personality. Incredible work ethic, incredible success, incredible passion for the sport. And we're lucky that he's there. We're lucky to have him. As I said, we're lucky that the Fertittas, Lorenzo and Frank, and Dana came along, because they were able to take the show to stratospheric heights. And so, gotta credit them. And we can argue about capitalism and fierce capitalism and competition and all that, but at the end of the day, you got to look out for the brand. You got to look out for your show. You got to do what you think is best for the show at all times.
Yeah. James, I always appreciate your time, your insight. I thought, the feedback on our first show, people really liked it and liked hearing.
Happy to be here. I appreciate it. Yeah, I enjoyed it as well. Glad Miguel was around for this one. Good back and forths.
Yeah, thank you, James. You're a freaking genius.
I don't know about that, but I was there. I was there a long time ago, and I still have fond and vivid memories from those days. So happy to share any commentary and insight I can. And thank you, Todd, for having me again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I know we went kind of long,
you
but
shut me up a few times, and I fucking usually ramble, and just
one of these days we'll do a show where we just talk about our favorite fights from those days.
Yeah, for sure.
I could give you some inside dope on those classic UFC fights from back in the day.
Definitely.
SEG era.
I'll tell you a story just to close out for Todd. That I think it was Bob Meyerowitz or no, it was Art Davie that made Joe Silva go back into Don Fry's locker room at the Puerto Rico show and try to grab the belt back and tell him that the UFC owed the belt.
Joe was not at that show.
Okay, so there was some other show, maybe the Ultimate, where
Joe didn't start. Joe didn't start coming to shows till maybe 10 or 11 or 12.
Okay, so maybe it was at the Ultimate, but Don Fry had won the belt, and Art Davie made him go back and say, "Hey, that belt belongs to the UFC. Get it back from him."
I don't know anything about that, but I could see Art doing that, and I could see Joe doing that too. I mean, he'd have no problem.
Yeah, Joe did his dirty work, and Don Fry, Don is Surly old goat when he wants to
Yeah,
be.
but a good guy. Also, I got some fun Don stories too. Next
I
time we'll
love
talk
that.
about fighters and fights and fun stories. That would be fun.
Yeah.
I closed out strip joints with Don.
Don Fry, I remember we were at a Waffle House after an interview, and he floated the idea of knockout bonuses. Way, way long time ago, Don Fry wanted knockout bonuses. He said, "Oh, it's bullshit. Those guys come in and win by submission. Bob should do knockout bonuses." I remember bringing it back to New York. I said, "Bob, yeah, Fry had a great idea. We should do knockout bonuses." Bob looks at me and says, "You want me to spend more money?" He threw me out of the office, and that was that. That was the last we heard of that. But it was a good idea. I always thought it was a good idea.
Definitely good. And you know what? Implemented.
Yep. Yep. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I
Anytime.
appreciate your time, James, as always. And everybody watching these episodes, check out James. He's on what's your Twitter handle?
I think it's James A. Werme. JamesAWERME.
And he does post from time to time, so you could
Once in a while.
actually correspond with him there.
I answer, that's for sure.
Yeah. And
So good to see an old school guy, dude. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, Miguel. We'd love to talk to you guys more about that stuff. The fighters and the fights is really,
It
so
was
much
a good
fun.
back and forth. I feel happy.
I'm glad. That means it was a good talk. I feel happy too. And yeah, we'll see how it pans out. Is it going to court?
yeah, well, tentatively, we'll see. If it doesn't get rectified, then it'll go to court, I think, October 18th.
So discovery is underway, or when do they start discovery?
I don't know when that would be, but because the judge is supposed to release why he turned down this initial settlement on Monday.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well,
He's gonna write write it out. Yeah, so that should be
20 years of
interesting.
emails, brother. 20 years of emails.
That'd be crazy. All right, guys. Well, appreciate it, James, as always, and everyone watching these episodes. Appreciate you supporting the episodes, and until next time, take it easy.
Hola, soy Litzy La Bomba Dilene, boxeadora profesional de México, y estás viendo el show de Todd Atkins, en donde verás y escucharás a grandes talentos del boxeo. No te lo puedes perder.